Welcome to Tanach Study and Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you are watching Archaeology Snapshot. And in today's episode, we are going to be going over Sefer Yehezkel, the book of Ezekiel, the prophet of Babylon. Let's get straight into it. So as always, what are we doing here? We are here to follow four basic questions, which is when is it happening? Who are the main players? Where are they located? And highlights from history and archaeology. So let's get into Sefer Yehezkel. So Sefer Yehezkel, as we know, is happening in Bavel, in Babylon, before the destruction of the first temple. So let's talk about Yehezkel for just a moment. This is an image which we're going to talk about very soon. You might be able to guess where I got this image from if you've been following Sefer Study for long enough. But if you're not familiar, we're definitely going to get to it towards the end. Sefer Yehezkel opens up on the river of Kevar, but before we even get there, we need a little bit of the background of when it's happening and where the story is exactly happening. So Yehezkel was actually in exile, a deportee from Yechoniah's exile, Galut Harash v'Hamazgeh, which we spoke about in Sefer Melachim and in Sefer Yirmiyahu, and that is in the year 597 BC. In other words, 11 years before the actual destruction, and he makes his way with the exiles by the Babylonian Empire all the way into Babylon. Now, the book of Yehezkel, Sefer Yehezkel, actually opens up in the 4th year of Galut Yehoyachin, and he has this vision, Ma'aseh Merkavah. We're going to talk about it in a second, but let's talk about the community in Babylon for just a moment. So first of all, the Jewish community comes into Babylon, is paraded into the Ishtar gates, as we've mentioned on numerous occasions, and I don't know if we're done with it yet. And they end up settling in an area known from inscriptions from cuneiform tablets, such as this one, as Al Yahudu. And these are described in length in some previous episodes, which I spoke about, especially in Yirmiyahu and a little bit in Melachim Bet. And this is from the exhibition in the Bible Lands Museum called By the Rivers of Babylon, Al Naharot Bavel, which describes the Jewish community in Babylon post-destruction, post-Galut Yehoyachin, and it really shows how the Jewish community rebuilt itself in Babylon, as in the words of Yirmiyahu, Bnu batim v'shevu nit'u ganot v'echlu et piryan, and dirshu et shlom ha'ir asher regleti etchem shama, ki b'shloma yeh lachem shalom. Where, in a nutshell, I just abbreviated to the psukim, where Yirmiyahu tells Galut Yehoyachin to pray for the well-being, to basically say, Misha berach in shul on Shabbat, for Nebuchadnezzar, for the success of the government, which is controlling our livelihood and our well-being. And so once they prosper, we will prosper as well. And that's indeed been the MO for Jews in the diaspora until this very day. So we've spoken about that in length. This is the Jewish community. Now, there's several different cities and areas that are mentioned in Sefer Yehezkel. There's the city of Tel Aviv, which is where the modern city got its name from. And there's also the beginning of the story, which happens on Nahar Kevar, the river Kevar, which you can see right over here in the image. And what happens on the Nahar Kevar? Yehezkel gets this vision of Ma'aseh Merkavah, which is basically the words which are used today to refer to esoteric matter, things that are happening in the upper spheres. And the vision is so complex that reportedly Rashi basically says, I give up. Doesn't even get into the commentary of what's going on there. It's really hard to understand. But what I'm going to say from an archaeological point of view is that in order to understand the imagery of all of the Nevi'im, any of the Nevi'im, and Yehezkel included, it's really important to be rooted in the ancient Near East and to understand the metaphors that he is using to describe the visions that he is having. So winged creatures with 4 faces going in different directions, you can see all of that in the ancient Near Eastern world of imagery. I don't have enough time to get into it now, but the point is that it's based in that imagery and it's important to recognize. Now, something cute which I saw in the supermarket over here is a wine bottle called HaMerkava, the Chariot. Now, I couldn't figure out exactly what this winery is. Ends up, I posted this on some kind of wine connoisseur group in Israel, and they said, don't even bother, this is cooking wine. It's simply imported from some Spanish cheap winery. I really can't stand behind what I said. This is just what people told me. And I just thought it would be cute to bring it here because I like talking about wine, and it's the Merkava. Now, hang in there towards the end because there's going to be another winery I'm going to mention which actually is practical, but this one I have completely given up finding where the winery is. And now I'd like to get into the Nevuot of Yehezkel, which are known for his flair for the dramatic. So the dramatic flair of Yehezkel comes across, whether it's in the visions that he has of, for example, take everything that I'm telling you and write it down on a scroll and eat the scroll, or let the words of the scroll be absorbed in your limbs, and now go ahead and use that as your fuel. Nice. But there's the things that he actually acts out, and one of the strange ones is take a clay brick and carve on it the city of Yerushalayim, and then lay a toy siege on it and get people to watch you. I mean, people were probably looking at Yehezkel like, what is this guy? Is he mad? I mean, if you look at the things he's doing, they are really designed to grab people's attention. And in the words of Dale Carnegie, if you want to get a message across, dramatize your ideas. Dramatize your ideas. And Yehezkel is definitely the forerunner to Dale Carnegie's Dramatize Your Ideas, because he really has a rich world of metaphors which he uses, and all kinds of acting gigs and stunts that he does. Fascinating stuff. So let's talk about bricks. So first of all, this is a brick which is inscribed with Nebuchadnezzar, and it is actually written, as I mentioned in Yirmiyahu, Nabuchuduri Usur, Nebuchadnezzar, which is how his name is written in Yirmiyahu, as opposed to in other books of Tanach, for example, here, and in Melachim, where it's Nebuchadnezzar. So the pronunciation can go back and forth, but that's just a function of how the language is pronounced and how it's sort of, well, different than the way we pronounce things today. Anyway, so speaking of bricks, just parenthetically, I'm going to say that using bricks in Bavel is, of course, something we've heard about way back in Migdal Bavel, in the Tower of Babylon. But the reason for that is because that mud is very readily available in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, whereas stone needs to be imported. Stone is not readily available. So taking bricks and baking them, baked clay bricks or just dry mud bricks, are the most common way of building houses and buildings in Babylon and Assyria as well, except there we also have carved stone. And so using baked bricks or mud brick is the typical way of building in Mesopotamia, especially in the area of Babylon, which is rich in mud. Now, this idea of taking a clay brick and carving a city on it is not unusual. Look at 3 examples. These 3 examples, all in the British Museum, from left to right, show you a city, the world, according to the Babylonian understanding, and again, the city of Babylon, 3 different cities. I think the first one is the city of Sipar. And these are carved on bricks, which were then baked. And so whatever it was Yehezkel was doing was not unusual. And again, as I was saying before, we need to understand the visual world of the Nevi'im that the prophets were living in order to understand what they're doing to dramatize their ideas and to get people's attention. Okay, so this is one idea. Now, the other one has to do with Ta'al HaGalabim, which has to do with a particular kind of razor. And this is an image from Olam HaTanach, which, like Da'at Mikra, has many, many related images to the topic, but not necessarily one-to-one. It's not going to be here's the image of, but rather, since we're talking about this particular artifact, let's say a blade. So let me show you an image of a blade, even though it's several hundred years earlier or later and from a neighboring civilization and not the same one. So this is the same idea, but it's still a Ta'al HaGalabim. It's a particular kind of blade that's used for shaving people's heads. And this is an imagery which Yehezkel uses to talk about how Hashem is going to take care of all the evil people, etc. Now, another idea here is worshiping the sun god. We have this concept of the Chamanim, which are mentioned, which are these particular monuments built to the sun god with the Chama. So here you have a winged sun disk, except this one has the god Ashur on top, and it's on top of a sacred tree. The sacred tree is a very famous icon in ancient Near East, and part of it, not all of it, has to do with creation, and part of it has to do with fertility. And that leads us to one of the thorns in our backside, Baal and Asherah. Let's look at an image of the Asherah, who has a tree growing out of her belly button, or rather they're just putting a tree there. Now, the connection between fertility and trees, as I possibly have mentioned in the past, is that birth from human seed or growth of a tree from a plant seed are miraculous things which are inexplicable. They're unexplainable. They are not understood without a scientific framework. They are just completely miraculous, which is why Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, is also referred to in terms of planting in the ground and it's something miraculous. It's like there's the comparisons between, just like the tree is something which is supposed to decay, the seed decays in the ground and then comes out blossoming with new life, so too the human being can come back to life. That's how it really spoke to people. If you look at the Gemara in Sanhedrin, where all these arguments between the Tzedukim and between the Perushim about whether or not there's such a thing as Tchiyat HaMetim, these are the metaphors they use because they really spoke to people. So when you think about people worshiping a fertility goddess like Asherah and planting trees, as the Navi says, Tachat kol etz ra'anan, under every green tree, that's because people wanted to reassure that they would have fertility, one of those very difficult things to guarantee, especially before modern medicine and vaccines and health. It's just very, very difficult. So people want to reassure themselves that they're going to be successful. So you can pray at shul or go to the temple, but you're also going to get a lottery ticket to make sure that just in case God wants a little bit of help to help me, I'm going to help God help me. So people have this idea, which I mentioned earlier with Eliyahu Hanavi at Har HaKarmel, Ad matai atem poschim al shtei seipim. Pick a side. You can't have it both ways. But this is what people were doing for a very long time. We were very, very stubborn, and Yehezkel was indeed warning us of the coming destruction by Bavel, and indeed that happens, and he continues his nevuot to the Jews who are in Bavel after the destruction, Hagolah miYerushalayim. Now let's talk about his other prophecies, because there's a significant part of Yehezkel, which is prophecies about the coming doom of very different nations. And it's important to understand the dynamics and the geopolitical impact of the various nations and their imagery in order to appreciate what exactly he's talking about. So some of the things he talks about is the pending doom and destruction and the siege upon various cities, such as Tyre, which indeed was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar for about 14 years, but he actually did not succeed in destroying it. But in order to fund that operation, he needed to invade Egypt. We actually just read that Haftarah a few weeks ago. Now, so this is just an Assyrian relief of the destruction of a city, but it's just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, of the pending doom of different nations. So one of the several nations he talks about, and I'm only going to talk about two of them, is the people of Tzor, the people of Tyre, the people known as the Phoenicians, which are northern Canaanites, they're Knaanim. Now this is an Assyrian relief from the Louvre, which shows you the Tyrians, the Phoenicians that is, going across the ocean to different cities with logs of trees, long trees, probably cedars of Lebanon, Arzeh Lebanon, on their boats in order to transport them and to trade in them. Now, the Tyrians, the Phoenicians, were famous for trading with many of the nations, all the way from the Arabian Peninsula and Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, and all the way to the Greek islands. And they traded in gold, silver, precious metals, iron, or what the equivalent of iron, metal. They had bronze, they traded in lapis lazuli, they traded in wood. I mean, these guys were an international trading empire. They connected many different countries, and indeed the Greek alphabet actually comes from their trading with the Phoenicians, whose Aleph Bet is as the one that we have, and that's where the Greeks got the Alpha Beta. They sort of adapted that for their language. So their trade had a massive impact, and they sort of, I guess, thought too much of themselves. And so the Navi is coming to tell you, you too, the Phoenicians, are also going to meet your end. Don't think so highly of yourself and think that you can get away with murder. So that's one of the Nevuot. And the other one, which I really, really love, is the one about Egypt. So he talks a lot about Egypt. He talks about the pending doom of the 26th dynasty, who was eventually blocked by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't invade Egypt, but he really blocks their impact, and Egypt is really, really going downhill from there. And then later on with the Persian Empire, it's all over. It's gone. This period is known historically as the late period. Okay? So what I want to show you is one metaphor which is used to describe Paro Melech Mitzrayim, even though several different cities are mentioned. For example, Migdol Sevene, Son, which is right next to Elephantine, right? It talks about the Eretz Patros. It talks about, the what's known as Upper Egypt, the south of Egypt that you see here. You're looking at a picture of the Nile from Google Earth. So I want to show you one very important imagery which he uses, which is very beautiful, and that's referring to Paro as Hatanim Hagadol Hashoretz Betochi Orav, the great crocodile in the Nile, who is convinced, Li Yeori v'ani asitini, the Nile is mine and I created myself. Now, we know from Egyptian mythology that there was this god, the crocodile god, known as Sobek, who is the Nile god, and there is a strong association between Paro, between the pharaoh, and the crocodile god in many different ways, because Paro, as we know from the story of Shemot, where Hashem says to Moshe and Aaron, Bo el Paro, Hineu Yotzeh Hamayma, is going into the water. Part of the daily, tightly regimented schedule of the Paro is to bathe in the Nile, to show people that it's being blessed by the fertility god, basically, by Paro, and is enabling you, farmers, to succeed with your work. And so there's a very, very strong connection between this. And in addition to that, the hieroglyph for rulership is actually a house with a crocodile on top of it. So the crocodile god called Sobek, there's the name Sobek Moses, right, is the name of the crocodile god, and there's statues of him. And in fact, in the city of Fayum, which is in Lower Egypt, which is closer to the delta, there is actually a temple for Sobek, and the Greeks called that place Crocodilopolis because the crocodile really was the patron god or the state god of that particular area, the city god of Fayum. Now, in addition to that, the Roman coins, which were minted in Egypt, had an image of a crocodile on it because the crocodile represented Egypt. So what I'm trying to say here is that the imagery of the crocodile, which is then ridiculed, as you see in this beautiful 929 image, is ridiculed by God saying, I'm going to drag you out of your Nile and have all the fish die in sticky, gross in your fins, and I'm going to make a mockery of you. But Paro really thinks of himself as all this hot stuff. It's deeply rooted in their mythology that the crocodile controls the Nile and Paro controls the Nile, and there's this connection between the power of the crocodile who controls the Nile and Paro Melech Mitzrayim. And so he's being made a mockery of, but in order to appreciate the Nebuah, you really need to know the imagery and the mythology from ancient Egypt. And our last point has to do with Geulah, with redemption. There's a whole bunch of Nebuah towards the end of Yehezkel, which talk about the redemption. Now, remember this guy? This is an image of Yehezkel, and those of you who've been following probably have guessed. This is the Dura Europos synagogue, which is on the Euphrates River in a city called Dura Europos, which means the fortress of Europos. And that was a cosmopolitan city which was taken over by the Sasanian Persians from the Romans back and forth. And this synagogue was on the frontier. And so the synagogue was actually filled in. It was land filled in order to become part of the battlements, part of the protection against the invading Sasanian Persians. And that's how it survived. So when this was discovered in the 1920s, 1930s by Yale University, they found dozens and dozens of beautiful frescoes, beautiful images of biblical scenes. We have seen several of them throughout the series, and we are not done with them. But the beautiful one I want to share with you now is a series of paintings which talk about Yehezkel's vision of the valley of dry bones, Hazon ha'atzamot ha'yeveshot. Now, this image goes from left to right, and you see how it describes in a very graphic way God's hand which takes him up and lifts him and brings him to this valley, and you see these decapitated heads and bodies all over this destruction. And then finally there's these angel figures, which I guess are the way they expressed something magical happening, and all the bodies are brought back to life, and you see him leading these people to redemption. And he's saying, this is basically Bet Israel. You think that it's all over, it's all dry bones, it's dead, they're going to come back to life. Now, a major part of the prophecy of the redemption in Yehezkel is the description of the third Beit HaMikdash. Now, this is a Temple Institute image of the second Beit HaMikdash, but as the Rambam says, and I think this is also brought in the Mishnah, that the way the second temple was designed is built a little bit on the prophecies of Yehezkel, but Yehezkel talks about the measurements of the third Beit HaMikdash in great detail, where he meets this construction Bob the Builder angel with a measuring laser, was showing him around the measurements of the Beit HaMikdash, and he somehow has this amazing idea, which strikes us as a little bit crazy because we are disconnected, that if you tell Bet Israel, you tell them the measurements of the Beit HaMikdash, they will do teshuvah, which sounds to us outrageous. But we need to let that sink in for a bit and realize what the idea is, because it actually had a profound impact. He also talks about the division of Eretz Yisrael into the tribes in a different way than we're used to, a lot of that stuff. But I want to end with a beautiful, beautiful nevuah, which the Gemara in Sanhedrin puts on a pedestal from Yehezkel to show us what is the absolute litmus test to know that the Geulah is coming. And that is the following nevuah. So this pasuk talks about the hills of Israel. Ve'atem harei Yisrael anpechem titenu uferyechem tis'u le'ami Yisrael ki kirvu lavo. You, mountains of Israel, shall yield your produce and bear your fruit for my people Israel, for their return is near. And if you look at this Shiloh Winery bottle, it says on it Yehezkel Lamed Vav Chet. Now, why did Amichai Luria put that on this bottle? Because he wanted you to look it up. And it shows you images of a productive vineyard. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says as follows: if you see that Am Yisrael are in their land, and the hills of Israel are bringing forth their fruits En lecha ketz megule mizeh. There is no clear indication that the ketz hayamim, that the end of days is coming, because the land is responding to its children. It's responding to its people. And there is no better time to see that than today, where we're seeing a beautiful blossoming. We're just coming out of Tu B'Shvat, celebrating the new fruit trees. Eretz Yisrael has come to life after 2,000 years. It is a beautiful country with beautiful produce. And I really, really hope that once all of this corona nonsense is over, you can come here. If you're abroad, or if you're here now, we've just finished the third lockdown, you'll be able to go outside, and hopefully you'll be watching this in the future and you'll say that's all history. But it's so beautiful to be able to see Eretz Yisrael really fulfill this prophecy of giving forth its fruit, Le'ami Yisrael ki kirvu lavo, because we have finally come back home, and because that is what we need to see. We need to see the land breathing and alive and responding to us. We need to respond in return and to really do what we need to do to continue this Geulah. May we be able to do that very soon, and be zochet to see the third Beit HaMikdash b'mira v'yameinu. But that's all I have for you for today. So I want to thank you very much for watching this episode, and I hope that you continue to hit that like button, which I forgot to say 100 times earlier. Make comment, subscribe, share this video, tell people about it, and join us in Tanach study for all our exciting episodes to come. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one, beginning Tre Asar.